Hello, in February 1895, Oscar Wilde was at the height of his powers. He was known on both sides of the Atlantic. He was feted in London society and celebrated in the West End, where an ideal husband continued to play to packed houses as The Importance of Being Earnest opened to ecstatic reviews. Quote, "The man who can dominate a London dinner table can dominate the world," unquote, he's reputed to have said. And he seemed on course to do just that. But in April of that year, he was arrested for the crime of gross indecency, and his swift descent from omnipotence began. It ended 5 years later, when, exiled and humiliated, he died famously beyond his means in a Paris hotel. Wilde's reputation spent a long time in the wilderness, but just over a century after his death, his stock is probably higher than ever before. Now that his rehabilitation seems complete, how should we understand his legacy? Was Wilde a reactionary, the last of the Romantics, or was he the midwife to modernism? Was there a coherent philosophy behind those beguiling epigrams, or was there little more to his aestheticism than dressing up, or, as Wyndham Lewis bitterly put it, exercising his one trick of reversing conventional morality without saying anything very interesting about it? With me to discuss Oscar Wilde and the Aesthetes is Valentine Cunningham, Professor of English Language and Literature at Oxford University, Regina Garnier, Professor of English at the University of Exeter, and Neil Samuels, Dean of Humanities at Bath Spa University and author of Wilde's Style. Valentine Cunningham, could you set the scene for us? Oscar Wilde's the most famous of his group, but who are his contemporaries in the 80s and 90s? Who are the Aesthetes and how did they come together?
I suppose the most important thing to think about Wilde is as a kind of case, of course, famously, but also as a kind of conduit, really. He is at the centre, really, a kind of pivotal person in the transmission into British consciousness and English literature of things that were going on in France, what you might call the sort of Baudelaire-Gautier tradition, and becoming a sort of centre in Britain for a kind of art for art's sake, a highly aesthetic vision of writing. And of course he's surrounded by a whole group of young men, particularly, who are also looking to France, John Gray, Arthur Symonds, Ernest Dowson, Lionel Johnson, some of them not so young, of course, who are trying to, as it were, be decadent, highly urban, conscious, highly kind of, well, there's no other word for it, highly modern, bringing, as it were, the city into literature, bringing a kind of post-Christian amorality, even immorality, into their writing, and standing up for the rights of art, as opposed to morality or realism or the external stuff.
Thank you very much. Neil Samuels, in his introduction to his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde writes, "Books are well written or badly written, that is all." And he adds, "All art is quite useless," which is an extension, in a way, of art for art's sake in its way. Can you untangle that? What does he mean by this? And is this a key statement for the Aesthetes?
I think it is, and I think it goes back to Pater, and beyond that to Gautier and the preface to Mademoiselle Maupin in 1836. And it's a key statement because it's trying to liberate literature from all kinds of utilitarian concerns and from being read simply for its moral content. Wilde is interested in surfaces and in style. And when he says all art is quite useless, it's what he's leaving out. You know, all art is not moralistic. At the same time, what separates Wilde from some of the other aesthetes of the period and from predecessors like Whistler is the fact that Wilde does have a very strong sense of the political implications and efficacy of art. And I think that makes him very distinctive and very important.
Wilde's reach was extensive. This little dispute that's been going on, discussion over the last 10 years about high and low art and so on. I mean, he was across it 100 years ago. He was interested in the way women dressed, in interior design, in the decoration of the houses of working people, as well as being interested in translating from the French, writing in French, and so on and so forth. How can you just tell us how what impact that had?
Well, I think as Janus faced, he looks back deep into his own century, to these predecessors in England and France like Pater and Baudelaire and Gautier. He also looks forward into our century, and he does anticipate some of the central tenets of contemporary cultural theory. But to understand that span of his reach, I think you could take a touchstone. I find it quite possible to imagine Wilde enjoying The Sopranos in a way that I can't of Thomas Hardy. The Sopranos, Chicago mobsters who spend their time watching The Godfather and behaving as if they're in a Martin Scorsese film. And that...
Martin Scorsese's in their film, never mind.
But that interest in images and image making, Wilde is in at that very early, at an age which is becoming saturated with advertising imagery. And Wilde wants to enjoy that and engage with it intellectually. He wants to exploit it. He treads a thin line, I think, between salesmanship and subversion. When he went to the States in the early 1880s, I think as Virginia says in her book, that costume, that beknickerbockered costume, which becomes an icon of aestheticism, was actually a contractual obligation. He had to wear that in order to meet his what the D'Oyly Carte Company demanded of him.
I've got to bring Virginia in, but it would be a brave intellectual aesthete these days who advised women on how to dress, which he did very firmly. Out with the whalebone, on with the loose-shouldered dress. Liberation through that sort of thing. That's as far as I can go on that. I'm lost on that. Carry on. Virginia, I'd like to go to the two people behind Wilde. From Pater, who wrote famously a book on, the book on the Renaissance. He was a great influence on Wilde at Oxford, and Ruskin was. Those two are very opposed, and out of those two, very crudely, Wilde got the basis for his thrust as an intellectual. Could you bring them in?
I can bring Pater in for science particularly. One of the things that Pater did was to talk about the Mona Lisa as the culmination of evolution. He was actually taking what he called the Darwinian idea and bringing the Mona Lisa, her face, the lines in her face were written in centuries and centuries of evolution. And this led into the way the Aesthetes talked about human psychology. The Aesthetes, and then leading into the decadence, human psychology was something that was a culmination that worked through time. And so psychology was complex. It was not Victorian in the sense that it was not always moving to a particular end. One's desires could be undermined by one's personal history. They thought about psychology in complex ways, which led directly into aestheticism in the sense that it is a particular moment, a particular picture of human personality.
Pater introduced the idea of surfaces, the idea of style, the idea of in a sense, art for art's sake, and so on. Ruskin had the idea of a public-spirited morality. Let's play with those two, Pater and Ruskin, behind this movement.
If Pater is the sort of very complex psychology, the takes on psychology, then Ruskin was the political economist of art. One of his most famous works is called The Political Economy of Art. And he took a particular idea that you could understand human history by seeing artistic works, by seeing the architecture around you and by looking at the visible surfaces of things. In that, you could actually read politics, you could actually read ethics, and that, too, was very much a part of what Wilde thought about. Art was so significant that you could actually understand the history of politics and ethics in it.
Do you think that Wilde found it difficult to bring both those influences to bear? Do you think he found himself shuttled between one or the other, or did a synthesis come easily to him?
I think a synthesis came fairly easily to him. He was extremely intelligent. He saw in the visible world the history that Ruskin was talking about, the history of social relations particularly. He said that he made no social distinctions in his private life, and that is often taken as a kind of joke. But in fact, he was a natural teacher in that he thought that people were equal. And Ruskin also thought that. Ruskin's whole project was to improve society. And he thought that one way you could see improvements in society was by looking at the quality of the architecture around you, of the work around you.
Neil Samuels, do you think that you can say Pater, Ruskin when you look at Wilde, or have Pater and Ruskin become Wilde? Have they made him the sort of thinker he was?
I don't think he really did form a synthesis. I think he collapsed the distinction between the two. I think you have Ruskin representing an ethical approach to art, Pater insisting on the aesthetic approach, and Wilde somehow managing to collapse the distinction. If we look at the picture of Dorian Gray, when he defends that novel against the attacks that it's immoral, he ends up talking about its ethical beauty. And I think that's a very brilliant insight into his own processes, because what he does in that novel is give us ethical content, but make it an element of the novel's design, so that if Dorian isn't punished in some way, there's no closure, and we as readers feel cheated. He gives us that moralistic appearance of a moralistic ending, but it's cancelled, and it's partly cancelled, I think, by the Paterese of the preface, because you read the novel through the preface, and there's a sense of a kind of deconstructive energy between this amoral preface and the moral shape of the narrative of Dorian Gray.
Well, that implies that our listeners are deeply aware and have in front of them the preface of Dorian Gray, so on and so forth. So I'm not moving on swiftly because it's difficult. I'm moving on swiftly to make it a little bit more general. I'm going to move on to the business of romantic or modernist, in a sense, whether it was looking back or whether it was looking forward. How did Wilde view himself, and how do you view the view of himself, Regina, as a reactionary or as a progressive?
I certainly think he's a progressive, but I think the thing that you want to say about Wilde and modernism is that he actually was making art a way of life. And I think the interest in Wilde is ultimately about making one's life a work of art more than making a work of art. As he said, he put his talent into his work, but he put his genius into his life. And I think that is a very modern idea.
I think he's anti-romantic because he rejects humanist notions of the deep, integrated, authentic self. He releases us into a world of self-fabrication and role-playing, and that looks forward. If he has any affinities with romanticism, it's with the sensuality of Keats and with the overreaching diabolism, almost, of Byron, I think. He certainly has nothing in common, in my view, with Wordsworth, who he really ridiculed in a number of places for turning the world into a kind of moral gymnasium.
One of the several things he got wrong. Valentine.
Yes, I think that's more or less right. And there's that lovely poem that he wrote about the sale of Keats's letters, and he was deeply involved, I think, emotionally in the kind of image of the lovely life of the poet Keats, which ends in such kind of horror and disaster. And it is true, isn't it? I agree very much that the sort of vision of the self which comes through in all of Wilde's kind of writings of every kind, the idea of the self as being unstable, which leads directly forward into T.S. Eliot and Prufrock and so on, a very kind of 90s sort of character, and it leads forward, of course, to the vision of the self, which you get in, I suppose, Joyce and Virginia Woolf, and there are whole pages of Pater which sound exactly like a description, like Virginia Woolf describing James Joyce, describing the importance of the self in the one who's unstable, impressionistic, and flickering.
You think that it basically almost wholly looking forward. We're not talking about a figure who we can say this is the end of. We're talking about someone who says this is the beginning of. Would you agree with that?
I think he's precisely a transition. I think that he brings up a lot of the aestheticism of the 1860s, the 1890s into the modern period. He's not formally, I mean, when you think about modernism as a formal movement, he's not formally like the modernists because he doesn't have the same breakups of narrative. He's known for his wit, and he's known for storytelling. And high modernism is not known for either one. It breaks up the stories.
Wyndham Lewis, for instance, who was a high modernist, was very, very dismissive of him.
He was very dismissive, but that was largely because of Wilde telling stories and Wilde being a wit. Lewis breaks up the narratives. He has high modernist form in ways that Wilde does not. But Wilde's wit is extremely modern in that it breaks up the ideology. It breaks up the fixed
Wilde
ways
has
of
a sense
teaching.
of humour, most modernists don't.
He does this in reactionary forms, not reactionary. He does this in traditional forms,
Yes.
doesn't he? I mean, he takes very traditional French
Yes.
play form when he does the Importance, the Ideal Husband. So, in fact, his second or third play, Salome, is written in French, so on. So he uses the traditional forms,
Yes.
and inside that he subverts the form. He doesn't subvert the form. He puts in a different
Yes.
ideas.
I think conventionally the way that Wilde was seen is as someone who is trapped in those conventions and trying to break free, and only really finds his authentic voice in The Importance of Being Earnest. And the plays that precede it, the social comedies in particular, are seen as failed attempts to establish a kind of authentic Wildean voice. I think that's a bit misleading. I don't think he's incarcerated in those conventions. I think what he's doing is displaying them in a certain way, with a certain style. He's borrowing deliberately and openly, and his audience is expected to pick up on those borrowings, not to think he's simply a magpie who is purloining material because he can't invent his own.
But it is interesting that in his comedies, in his plays comedies, he's drawing on traditional French comedy, and in his great novelists, he's drawing on the traditional Gothic novel. And so we're taking traditional forms. I'm just not...
That's very modern. That's what
Yeah.
T.S. Eliot does, right? It's the idea of borrowing from everywhere as putting together the tradition.
Wilde
It's
is
a
not
tradition that is not insular. It's a tradition that is cosmopolitan.
I mean, Wilde is not original, I think it has to be said. He is a great borrower, he's a great magpie. Influences stick on him like mad. And we also have to reflect that the plays that were great successes on the London stage were written, of course, to make money, and of course they played with the conventions. Otherwise, he wouldn't have got them produced. And it does seem to me that one should say that his most important play is the one that was first performed in France and in French, Salome. That seems to me the most important of his dramas, and it goes along with the picture of Dorian Gray and so on. I mean, I think it's misleading to focus on Wilde, even the Wilde of the importance of...
Why do you
I
think...
would
there was
disagree
shaking of heads
totally
going
with
around
that.
the table. Just a second. One at a time. You think Salome is the most important play? First you.
I suppose I think The Importance of Being Earnest is, when Auden called it a verbal opera, I think he was putting his finger on the way that Wilde uses language in The Importance of Being Earnest as being almost unique. That it is a language that makes you stop and think about the ideas. It's witty, it's very, very funny, but when he says charity creates a multitude of sins, when he uses the language that makes you stop and think about all the cliches, that ends up being a very critical take, and I think Wilde's known for that kind of critique.
I think his most important play is The Importance of Being Earnest. I think it's his most stylised, I think it's his most stylish, and I think it's his most political in a very indirect way. Salome, I think, is a failed experiment. I think after Lady Windermere's Fan, when he made about £7,000 in the first year, and it was commercially successful, he tried to signal that his real affinity was with the European avant-garde, and he tried to plug into that. And what he produced is a play which he thought was cutting edge, which now seems to me to be very dated. I mean, Lady Markby in An Ideal Husband says there's, the danger with being very modern is you're going to become old-fashioned very quickly.
We see that all around us.
And I think that Stephen Burkoff's production blowtorched the text of all that 1890s bric-a-brac and brought it alive, but it needs an approach as radical as that to save it from looking like something from...
Well, it's an opera. I mean, it's known now primarily
Excuse
as an
me,
opera.
I've got to go back to the guilty person, Cunningham, really. And the case has been made very strongly against. It's 2-1 on, and betting persons would say, you've got to run fast now, Valentine.
I think my colleagues here are being deceived by the glitter and the flash. And as for a kind of moral force of the epigrammatist, popular dramatist, I mean, it has no moral force at all. I mean, the kind of simple inversions are just kind of games playing. It seems a kind of verbal games
You mean
playing.
charity creates a multitude of sins, being a simple inversion is games playing?
Absolutely, and that's the kind of low side of I think Wilde's tremendous investment in what I suppose is one of the greatest and most impressive and daunting and moving sort of subjects or visions of the self in and through the 19th century, and namely the sort of doppelganger motif, which Wilde pursues and nicely. It kind of takes the elements of that and gives us, having said he's not original, gives us a kind of original version of the doppelganger in the picture of Dorian Gray, and then, of course, at the same time, he's living this sort of story or myth by living in these two worlds, the world of the glitterati and also the inverted world, the underworld, the world of the invert, and so on, which, of course, dragged him down. He put his life, if you like, where his imagination was. And I see the epigrammatist, aphoristic Wilde as giving the public a kind of, if you like, a kind of low version of the inversions of the doppelganger kind of myth and imagination.
Let's talk now about try to bring Wilde's life and his work together in a way. In the Renaissance, Walter Pater wrote, "To burn always with this hard gem-like flame," you've all heard this a million times, "to maintain this ecstasy is success in life." What influence did that, Neil Samuels, do you think, have on the way Wilde lived his life, or did he just coincide with the way he wanted to live his life anyway?
I think he was very heavily influenced by Pater, but I think what Pater does is give an intellectual justification for Wilde's temperament and predilections. What it's about is, as Pater put it, forcing as many sensations and pulsations into every moment. And Pater's interested in the epiphany, in those moments which stand out, which have a kind of wholeness and a sense of form and a sense of value. And I think it's actually Pater's interest in the epiphany and through Wilde that we get up to Virginia Woolf and James Joyce.
I want to come to Wilde's life and work in the last stretch that we've got. And Virginia, can I ask you, you quoted it earlier, it's fair, everybody knows this, "I put my genius into my life and my talent into his work." Well, did he, and how did he?
Yes, he did. I think he was very much torn about exactly the kind of material things that Neil is talking about. I think Wilde was very much attracted to modern life, to all the glitter of modern life. He's attracted to what we call commodity culture. He was part of a circle of young men who gave each other expensive gifts and lived very well indeed. He was attracted to all that, but he was also extremely intellectual. And when he wrote from prison that the one thing he regretted was that he had been too materialist in his life. He didn't regret his sexual tendencies. He didn't regret any of that. He regretted being too attracted to the superficies of
He
life.
hasn't answered the question. Can you give me some examples of how he put his genius into his life and his talent, which is a lesser thing than genius, into his work?
He responded
Or
to...
just another of those inversions that has gathered attention for 100 years, well, gathered attention for another 100 years, but when you actually try to crack it, it doesn't add up to much.
He responded perfectly to different audiences.
Well, lots of people do.
No, not lots of people responded perfectly. He wrote perfectly to different groups of people. He did the society comedies for a particular audience of people. He wrote the poems for a different audience.
He distinguished, Regina. I'm sorry, I'm probably being terribly pedantic here.
You mean his tragedy. You mean the so-called tragedy of his life.
I'm trying to examine this sentence. I put my genius into my life.
Yes.
I believe that's to do with living.
Yes.
And my talents into my work. Now, your answer has always been he wrote this, that, and the other. That, for me, is work.
He
so where's the genius in his
tried to live
life?
freely, right? He tried to live freely. And that is what he thought the aesthetic life was. The aesthetic life was, he said, acting at the level of personality freed from the trammels of everyday life. And he tried actually to live that way. And that would be a work of art. I don't see his life as tragic. Many do. Many see his life as ending as a tragedy.
He had a fantasy of the beautiful life that could be lived by the highest and most engaged artists.
I'm just mildly interested.
But
did
what
he
are we-
do it?
but what are we
It just seemed
going-
to me he knocked around like a lot of very talented, rich glitter artist celebrities who do still now and then.
He wasn't.
I wouldn't call that
he wasn't
genius.
rich.
I think that
After
distinction.
7,000 quid at the time for Lady Windermere's Farm was an awful lot of money.
He
100 years
spent a
ago.
lot of money
Yeah,
as well.
he
But
went
people
mad.
get
that
an awful lot, they spend a lot of money.
between-
It doesn't mean you're not rich. It means you spend a lot as well as being rich.
distinction between genius and talent is a rhetorical device.
Well, that's an interesting answer.
I think for sustaining his dandyism, because the dandy has to appear insouciant. The dandy can't be seen to be trying hard, and he was repeatedly dismissive of his writing, I think, in order to get partly to get his retaliation in first, and partly to create the impression that he put no effort into it. Although, in fact, we know from looking at the manuscripts that he revised and polished and worked hard through composition, emendation to performance. He was a professional man of the theatre who worked very hard at that, but that doesn't fit with the dandy's poise, with the dandy's nonchalance, with the dandy's cool.
When I said
Can I
it was-
just draw you on this?
When I said
Valentine,
he had a
then
fantasy of the beautiful life, I deliberately used the word fantasy, and I would go on to say, of course, you have to look at how beauty was defined for him. It was a matter of service, but dangerously, and this is where Wilde put his life where his aesthetic doctrine was. Beauty was for him always something below of what he called scooped in, as it were, what in Dorian Gray is called the sordid shame of the great city. It's a kind of spilt socialism. It was, of course, an anti-Christian gesture, an anti-conventional gesture, but the world of the rent boys and the male prostitutes and so on, going down
The feasting with
into
panthers.
going down into the world of rough trade and so on, a world which destroyed a lot of people. Wilde's friend Simeon Solomon went to jail for soliciting in public lavatories and so on. Wilde knew, as it were, the dangers of all that, and yet he saw that as essential to the idea. It was the doppelganger, if you like, of the beautiful, glittering, dandy-esque surface world that he embraced also so eagerly, and that, in a sense, was partly where he tried to build a kind of beautiful life, not in any conventional sense, but in that sense, and that is in fact what just brought him crashing down.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because, in a sense, the beauty allied with danger, which is the pater idea, which leads on to the feasting with panthers, and that might be the sort of life, the hard gem-like flame, the life he wanted. That's where he maybe thought the genius was. He maybe just thought that there was more quality of pleasure and imaginative satisfaction in leading this life, these forays to the east, which in his case was East London, while he was a respectably married man in Chelsea and so on and so forth.
And
He might have thought that
Salome is so
rather than the talent in his work, which had a sort of Ruskin-esque feeling of it. What did you say?
I say this is why
I'm talking too
Salome
much.
is so important and interesting
I'm not
to
gonna let go
go
of
back to
Salome.
that, because it is precisely a great image of the vision of loveliness as being also dangerous and destructive.
Mm-hmm. He's always trying to find the relation of desire and taste to larger motives. And that, I suppose, is Pater and Ruskin.
Thank you very much to Valentine Salome Cunningham, Regina Garnier, Neil Samuels. We'll be back next week with Linda Partridge, Dawkins and Steve Jones talking about the gene. Thanks for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.